Welcome, everybody. I'm Sue Nakanishi from the Langley Adams Library, and a special shout out to Robert Hayes from Tewksbury's Library, who's handling the technical side. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about our special guest speaker today. Gregg Jones is a longtime foreign correspondent and investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's covered civil wars and insurgencies in Asia and Latin America, the fall of Asia's two longest ruling 20th century dictators, and the early months of the US war in Afghanistan. He's the author of the acclaimed nonfiction books, The Honor and Dust, Theodore Roosevelt, War in the Philippines, and The Rise and Fall of America's Imperial Dream, and Last Stand at the Khe Sanh, I might not be pronouncing that correctly, the U.S. Marines' finest hour in Vietnam, which received the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation's General Wallace M. Greene Jr. Award for Distinguished Nonfiction. And I just want everybody to know that Gregg is at a library out in Wyoming. So he's on the road and is taken this afternoon to speak with all of us. So without further ado, will you please join me with a nice warm welcome to Gregg Jones?
Thanks very much, Sue. Thank you, Robert. Thanks to all of you for joining today. Really a thrill to see people logging in and to see where you're logging in from all over the place. And when you work on a book, it's a pretty solitary endeavor. You do a lot of research, go to archives, libraries, and even though you're among people while you're doing the research, that you're really in your own little world and sort of tunnel vision. And then the writing process, which is really the pain cave of where you're retreating into your own world and then trying to take that mountain of information that you've gathered and to shape it into a compelling narrative. This part of the process where the book is out and I get to spend time with readers, people who love books, people who love American history, is a real thrill for me. I know you all could be doing something else right now, so I'm deeply grateful for you having the interest in this story and in tuning in for this. I am coming to you from the Moose Room of the Public Library in Cody, Wyoming. Just rolled in here a few minutes ago from three terrific events in Nebraska. Ben Kuroki was from Nebraska, grew up in Nebraska on a farm there, and so we kicked off things in Lincoln at the Nebraska History Museum, and then did a terrific event in Lincoln County, Nebraska, which is close to Ben's home in a small village called Hershey. And then I was at the Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gary, Nebraska yesterday, which was a terrific event. They just inaugurated a new Japanese hall that is world class, and it's just a wonderful repository of information and history on the Japanese American population, really nationwide, but more kind of focused on the Plains area, including Nebraska. It's great to be with you. I was really thrilled that we could make this work. And I'm in Cody, by the way. I should mention for the Heart Mountain pilgrimage. Heart Mountain was one of the 10 Japanese American incarceration camps during World War II. There's a national historical landmark there. And there's an annual pilgrimage of families, people who were incarcerees, and their families and scholars who come to Cody and go out to the camp and listen to various speakers and things. So I was here last year doing research, and I'm really honored to come back this year to meet people. What I'd like to do today is break Ben's story down into four areas. His combat experiences, which obviously shaped and scarred him. Um, then his exposure to the incarceration camps in 1944, and then his post-war life. The first post-war chapter was an extraordinary time in his life that Ben referred to as his 59th mission. And then Ben's long goodbye, his reemergence very late in life as a public figure. Um, so, Robert, if we could flip over to the first slide, um, and I'm asked go on to the one beyond the cover there. I've been asked a lot of how did you come to this story? How did you um, decide to tell Ben Kuroki's story? And for me, the answer to that question is rooted very deeply in my childhood. And this photograph is one of the artifacts from my family that speak to that. This photograph was taken in April 1943. That's my mother at the left front, her next oldest sister, Hazel, in the middle, my grandfather, Floyd White, at the right. And then in the back was the oldest child, my mother's oldest brother, actually not the oldest child, second oldest child. My Aunt Virginia was the oldest, but LH was the oldest boy. And his name was simply LH, just the initials. And he joined the Army Air Forces in February 1942 and wound up being trained as a radio operator and then deployed to England in May of 1943 and was assigned to the 93rd Bomb Group. This photograph, again, was taken LH's final home leave before reporting to his next station in preparation for deployment. I didn't know this at the time, but my uncle LH served in the same unit with Ben Kuroki in the summer and fall of 1943, the 93rd Bomb Group, which was the first B-24 bomber group to join the 8th Air Force in England. So I grew up with hearing fragments of the story of what happened to my uncle. And my mother was the youngest child. There was an aura of mystery that surrounded my uncle's story. All that was known was he and his crew disappeared over Austria on October 1st, 1943. And that set in motion a long ordeal, a 7-year ordeal. They were missing in action, listed as MIA for a year, then presumed KIA after 1 year. And then eventually, families were notified in 1949 that remains had been recovered, and they were determined to be those of my uncle and 8 comrades. It turned out that the navigator, one man, managed to bail out of the aircraft before the plane went down. There was a funeral in 1950. My uncle and 8 crewmates are buried at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis. And we visited that grave on Memorial Day and other special occasions. I grew up on the eastern edge of the Missouri Ozarks, about 3 hours south of St. Louis. Now, Ben's story very quickly began, at least for me, to intersect with the story of my uncle. Robert, if you want to flip to the next slide. When I was very young, we would visit my grandmother every Sunday, and my grandmother had a book that was published in 1962 about the very famous almost suicidal low-level raid of August 1st, 1943, on Hitler's most important source of oil in Romania. The Romanians would pronounce it as Ploiești. It's been anglicized as Ploiești. The Ploiești low-level raid was a very, again, costly raid. About 350 young Americans were killed in that raid, and that was about a quarter of the men who flew that raid. My uncle and his crew flew that raid. They survived it. Ben Kuroki and his crew flew that raid as well and survived it. In this book that was published in 1962 on the raid, there was a 64-page photo insert, 25 pages into that photo insert. You come across this photograph of Ben Kuroki. This shows Ben after his final mission in Europe, his 30th mission, when he was nearly killed by a German anti-aircraft shell that hit his top turret and knocked him unconscious, ripped away his oxygen mask. So this was looking at that book, coming across this photograph as a child was the first time that I intersected with Ben's story. Over the course of decades, and I'm going to compress about 40 years of personal history here to just say that I spent decades doing research on what happened to my uncle and his crew after I became a journalist, and I learned some skills of how to get public records, how to file public records requests, and I tracked the story to Austria. I interviewed people on the ground in Austria, tracked down family members. And as I was interviewing veterans of the 93rd Bomb Group in the early 1990s, again, I started hearing Ben Kuroki's name and kept bumping into his story. I didn't interview Ben. Ben was lying low at the time, had really sort of withdrawn from public life. But a number of men I interviewed told me bits and pieces of Ben's story. So I was fascinated with Ben's story, but I still didn't know a lot about it. I tried over the course of about 30 years to write a book about my uncle and his crew. I was still learning the craft. I was learning how to write narrative history. I was learning how to take research and shape it into a compelling narrative. The things that I was writing, the chapters I was writing, weren't very good. And then when I did learn to write better narratives, I started bumping into the problem that no one in the publishing industry was really very interested. The story was viewed as too mundane, that it happened again and again and again. And agents and publishers, editors, acquiring editors at publishing houses. I had some nibbles at times, but ultimately there was just the sense that it wasn't compelling enough story. So I would go off and I would write a book, and then I would come back to the story and try to revive it and find a publisher and get a lot of rejections again, and then would write another book and then come back to the story. And ultimately, in 2021, I reached the point of where I felt like that at least for the time being, that I had to move on. And I wanted to tell part of the story, at least honor my uncle and the other young men. 26,000 men died serving with the 8th Air Force in World War II. And how could I do that? What was a story that I could tell that might interest a broader audience in a publishing house? And that story from my childhood of Ben Kuroki was rattling around in my head, and I first had to be convinced that this story had the depth and breadth that it could sustain a book treatment. And so I spent about a month, December 2021, really running various threads of Ben's story to ground, and every day was a day of new discoveries and new exciting discoveries. And I quickly realized that Ben's story was just epic in its sweep. And not only was there a book there, but I thought there was a terrific book there. So I spent a few months writing the story in miniature, writing a proposal, gave it to my literary agents, and they found a really terrific home for it, an eager editor, which makes all the difference in the world. And then I was off and running in writing Ben's story. Again, one of the defining chapters in Ben's story is his combat service. Robert, if we could move on to the next slide. Um, I learned in doing that preliminary research, Ben had grown up in poverty in rural Nebraska in a farming family. If you want to move on to the next one, he was very shy as a boy and adolescent, began to come into his own as a teenager, graduated from Hershey High School with a class of 10 students in 1936. And then after Pearl Harbor, if you want to move on to the next one, Robert, um, Ben would later say that for the first time in his life, that he felt shame at his Japanese heritage, that his parents had always taught him, do not bring shame on the family. And so Ben was really shaken by the events of Pearl Harbor and was convinced that he had to do something to prove his loyalty, to prove his patriotism, to prove his Americanism. And so the day after, he and his next younger brother, Fred, tried to enlist in the Marine Corps in North Platte, the closest big town. They were turned away by the recruiter there. There was a lot of uncertainty whether the US military was going to accept Japanese Americans. Ben heard on the radio that the Army Air Forces was taking recruits at a recruiting station in Grand Island, about 150 miles away from his home. So Ben phoned up. The recruiting sergeant said, "Yeah, come on over." Ben and his brother drove over there. They got there. Recruiting sergeant then sort of backtracked a bit and said, "Not sure we're going to be able to take you. Go home and let me get back to you in a couple of days." A couple of days later, he said, "Yes, we'll take you." So Ben and his brother drove back over. And this is a newspaper page from one of many Nebraska newspapers that ran the photograph in the upper left-hand corner of this page. And I'm not sure how well you can see it, but this photograph shows Ben and his brother saluting as they were taking the Army oath and being accepted into the Army as new recruits. Um, Robert, if you want to move on to the next one. So Ben, uh, very quickly after being inducted into the Army Air Forces in the first week of January 1942, he was put on a train, he and his brother Fred, to Shepherd Field, Wichita Falls, Texas, for Air Corps basic training. And that was the first really terrible experience that Ben had with bigotry, prejudice, ostracism, nasty comments, hateful looks. And it was that way on the train ride. It was that way all the way through basic training. Within a few days, Ben's brother Fred was abruptly removed from the Army Air Forces. A number of other young Japanese American men who had enlisted got the same treatment, was put in a regular Army unit digging trenches and ditches. Ben was left, but it was a very lonely and hard time. After he made it through basic training, was sent to Fort Logan, just south of Denver, for clerical training. After clerical training, and I should say, at clerical school for the first time, Ben began to make a few friends. and a few people treated him in empathetic and humane fashion. Um, After clerical school, he was sent to Barksdale Field, just outside Shreveport, Louisiana. This photograph was taken in Barksdale. Ben was assigned to the 93rd Bomb Group. Now, Ben, in the 93rd, desperately wanted to go into combat. Um, he was not assigned to a combat crew, and he had to fight really for months to be given the opportunity to fight. He was initially assigned as a teletype operator, even though the 93rd didn't have any teletype machines. And there were several other men who were in the outfit. They had men that they didn't know what to do with. And so Ben was in that group of men. This is with this photograph shows Ben with one of his new friends in the 93rd Bomb Group. Robert, if you want to go on to the next slide. When the 93rd moved on to Fort Myers, Florida for training, two sergeants, two bigoted sergeants, old Army, felt that Japanese Americans should not be allowed to stay in the outfit. I tried to get Ben booted. Ben begged and pleaded with higher officers, and they said, we'll bring you along. So Ben went to Florida, still wasn't accepted into a combat crew, but was starting to make closer friends. This actually was a friend from clerical school, a dear friend who was in another outfit within walking distance of Ben's post at Fort Myers. Go on to the next photo. Ben was continuing to dream of combat. I love this photo of Ben, and these are photographs from Ben's personal scrapbooks, which he donated in the final years of his life to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And according to the archivist and curator who has possession of this collection, I was the first outside scholar to actually do research in this collection. And it's marvelous. It really covers the full arc of Ben's life. This photo, what I love about it is it really shows Ben's dream of combat, his passion for it. Keep in mind, this photo was taken in the summer heat of Florida. Ben has his leather flight suit on and was thrilled to be wearing this, which made him feel that he was getting a step closer to combat, even though, once again, he was not assigned to a combat crew. Move on to the next slide, please. When the 93rd was getting ready to deploy to England, once again, those two bigoted sergeants tried to get Ben bounced from the unit. This time, the colonel in command of the unit, Edward Timberlake, overruled after Ben once again begged and pleaded, and so Ben was taken along. The air crews flew over to England, flying. They picked up new aircraft in Guinea Field, New Hampshire, stopped in Newfoundland, and then on to Scotland, and then on to a field in England. Ben and the ground echelon forces went by ship across the Atlantic during a time when the German U-boat war was really in a very intense phase. And so it was a bit of a harrowing passage, but Ben and others arrived. In England, Ben was still in a clerical role and was not getting his opportunity to serve on a combat crew. But as the 93rd got into action in the fall of 1942, they started to lose gunners, they started to lose men, and some of the men started to break down from combat stress. Keep in mind that combat duty in the Army Air Forces was voluntary. So if you were on a combat crew, you could ask to be taken off at any time. You might be reduced in rank and sent to the kitchen, possibly to an ordnance crew or things like that. But you could opt out of combat. So that began to open up opportunities. And so Ben finally begged and pleaded and got his opportunity. This wonderful photograph here was Ben was given a temporary opportunity with a crew that had a gunner that was sick or injured, and so the pilot um, agreed to give Ben a test run, and so they went up for a test flight with the crew. When they got back down on the ground, Ben insisted on posing with the crew for a photograph, and this was the crew of Wham Bam was the name of the aircraft. So that didn't work out. That Ben was not assigned permanently on it, but another crew took Ben on, and Ben began his combat career in December of 1942. Robert, if we want to move on. Um, Ben was assigned to a crew just as the 93rd was being deployed to North Africa. If you recall, in November of 1942, Operation Torch landings in North Africa took place, and so that was the first time that U.S. forces were in ground action in the Mediterranean or European theater. In this case, it was Mediterranean in North Africa. Uh, and so the 93rd was sent for temporary duty in North Africa to fly support missions. They were bombing German port facilities, first in North Africa, and then ports in Italy that were used to ship material to the German and Italian forces fighting the US and the British in North Africa. This photograph shows, this isn't Ben's crew, uh, but it was a 93rd crew, and the men lived in tents, and they were stationed at a desert base in far eastern Libya, almost to the border with Egypt, in the Libyan desert in the Sahara. And So the men lived in tents. Water was rationed. It was very rough, crude living. This was a briefing for a mission. So they're standing around a chalkboard that would lay out the formation for the day. The weather was very mercurial. A lot of missions were wiped out by weather. They would get storms, sandstorms, and it was tough duty. But Ben began to fly missions, and within a couple of months, he had logged 14 missions in North Africa. Now, I want to just quickly touch on some moments that were really searing, intense moments for Ben that I think shaped him and scarred him. On that first mission, Ben was assigned as a waist gunner. Just a few feet behind him in the tail of the B-24, the tail gunner was hit by German fire in the head. He survived, but it was a gruesome injury. And Ben and his other comrades were trying to fend off German fighters. They were under attack and in danger of being shot down. So their friend was lying in the floor of the plane while they're having to fight to save their lives. And as soon as they cleared German fighters, and they could go back and tend to their friend. But that was a searing incident back on the ground after that first mission. Ben would later recall thinking, I'm not going to survive this. I'm not going to make it to 10 missions. And he just wrapped his head around he accepted the fact that he was going to die, that he was not going to survive a full combat tour. Next slide, please. Ben eventually made it back to England in the spring of 1943. And this shows this wasn't Ben's crew, but this was from the 8th Air Force records. It shows a B-24 crew from the 93rd Bomb Group crew flying a plane called the Exterminator, gearing up, ready to climb into the plane to take off. They were flying raids into occupied France, occupied Belgium, and starting to kind of peck around the edges of Germany. Another important thing to keep in mind is There was a flawed strategy that U.S. They were known as the bomber mafia, that they had conceived that the bombers could fight their way into Germany without fighter escorts. It wasn't until late 1943 that the long-range P-51 Mustangs were developed and would accompany the bombers all the way in to Germany. So in these months, the crews had an escort that got them essentially across the English Channel and a little bit into occupied territory, but then they were on their own. And the German fighters and ground anti-air defenses were developing more and more sophisticated tactics, and so the Americans were losing more and more planes. They were bombing by daylight and losing a lot of planes. On May 29th, 1943, Ben flew another mission that was yet another near-death experience that he had. It was on the German submarine pens on the coast of France at a place called La Police, France. Ben and his crew were approaching the target at 23,000 feet when suddenly all four engines conked out. All four engines died. They had a wonderful pilot by the name of Jake Epting from Tupelo, Mississippi. Jake Epting had a wonderful feel for flying. He was only about 5'5", 5'6". He actually had to sit on some books so his feet could reach the rudder pedals. But Epting was a terrific pilot. He's frantically trying to get the engines restarted as they plummet toward the sea below. They were down to 2,000 feet, 2,000 feet from crashing into the Bay of Biscay when Jake Epting finally got the engines restarted and they leveled off. They made it back to England, to their base, and Ben and the others tried to joke about it, but they were badly shaken. In their debriefing on the ground, an intelligence officer would debrief crews after they landed. He made a notation at the end of their debriefing session, and I want to read this to you. That I found the document in the National Archives in my final pass at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, and you're going through boxes of documents day after day, and you usually find some useful things, but for the most part, you're looking at thousands of pages of documents, and it informs your greater knowledge, but they're not pearls. One afternoon, I found a wonderful pearl, and I was looking for the sortie reports, the single crew reports on this La Police mission, and digging through 93rd Bomb Group records, and then I found Ben's crew's sortie report, and it was about 8 or 10 pages, and in one of the back pages there was a notation from the intelligence officer, and it read, quote, 10 nervous wrecks, candidates for rest home. The rest homes were what were sometimes euphemistically known as flak farms. Men who were suffering from combat stress were sent into the countryside. English manors had been taken over, manor houses, and so the men could decompress, feed the swans, read, ride bikes, do whatever, just to get away from combat. But Ben and his crewmates were badly shaken by that incident. The next incident I want to tell you about, if we move on to the next slide, was that low-level raid on the Ploesti oil fields, August 1st, 1943. A horrific raid. Ben and his comrades, Ben was in the top turret at this point, and so he really had a 360 view of everything. And just ahead of them, the group commander and his co-pilot, they took a couple of direct hits, and the plane was essentially a flying torch. But they somehow those pilots managed to stay in the cockpit and keep leading the bombers on until they crashed. And Ben saw all this happen. Ben saw comrades getting shot down on either side, explosions, the pilot having to navigate to miss smokestacks, exploding oil storage containers, and all sorts of things. So it was a horrific raid. When Ben and his comrades got back on the ground, they were shocked that no one else from their squadron had gotten back, and so many 93rd crews were missing, and there were so many empty tents. The terrible long night the next morning. The mess lines are so short because so many men didn't make it back. The commanders knew they had a morale problem after that raid. Ben and the other men who flew it were having trouble sleeping, having trouble eating. When they were sleeping, they were suffering from nightmares. So the next slide shows Ben and his crewmates. The higher ups were flying crews who had flown the raid into Cairo and to Alexandria, Egypt, for a few days of R&R. And so this photograph shows Ben, and Ben is in the foreground of this photograph. Ben and his comrades taking a very pleasant carriage ride around the streets of Alexandria, Egypt. Ben also posed in a policeman's fez. It's a wonderful snapshot. I don't have that in the slideshow, but it's in his collection. And so, for 3 days, the men slept in a nice hotel on clean sheets, ate real food, and tried to forget about the war. And then they were back to the war. Ben, if you want to go to the next slide, Ben, a couple of raids after the Ploesti mission, finished 25 missions, which was the combat tour for 8th Air Force heavy bomber crews at the time. Ben could have gone home at that point, but he felt like he needed to do more, so he asked to fly 5 more missions. 93rd returned to England, and Ben rejoined the campaign, the daylight bombing campaign against Nazi Germany in that grim fall of 1943, when casualties were soaring and morale was plummeting. The crews, again, there was this sense of fatalism that settled over the crews, that they weren't going to make it. They were losing so many comrades. Ben finally reached his 30th mission and flew that mission, if we get to the next slide, into Germany. The target was Munster. Over the target, a German shell, anti-aircraft shell, hit Ben's turret, nearly took his head off. And as I mentioned earlier, knocked him unconscious, ripped his oxygen mask away. It was a few minutes before a crewmate found Ben. He was turning blue. He was dying from hypoxia and was probably within minutes of death, but got the oxygen mask back on. Miraculously, not a scratch on Ben. Didn't even get a Purple Heart for that. But Ben returned to the States. Next slide. And even by the time he had returned, Ben had this dream that he felt there was still one box he needed to check to prove his patriotism, and that was to serve a combat tour in the Pacific. Now, at the time, there were no people of Japanese descent who were serving in the military who were allowed to fly in bomber crews or air crews in the Pacific. So Ben kept nagging the War Department, and in 1944, Ben finally persuaded the War Department. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had to write a personal letter giving Ben a dispensation, permission to be deployed to the Pacific. We get to the next slide. we'll see Ben with his B-29 crew. And then the next slide will show where he was sent. This was Tinian, an island in the Marianas chain. And Tinian was essentially ground forces had taken it in 1944. The Japanese had used Tinian. They had colonized the Marianas, and the island was planted almost shore to shore with sugarcane. And so the island, U.S. forces had taken it in amphibious assault, and almost immediately Seabees were sent in and started building airfields. So Tinian became almost an aircraft carrier it was just filled with landing fields. And so Tinian was one of the islands where the climactic B-29 campaign against Japan was flown using these fields. Now, Ben, not only now did he face the danger of being shot down, being killed in action, he faced the danger of being shot on the ground. There were still holdouts, Japanese imperial forces on the ground who were hiding in cane fields, hiding in caves and other places on the island. And so the ground forces that provided security were very trigger happy. And they would frequently hear shots being fired at night. Guards would hear a rustling in the cane fields and open fire. Ben and Ben's crewmates were very protective of him, and they tried to escort him everywhere so he wouldn't be mistaken for an enemy soldier and shot. Ben joked that he deserved a Purple Heart um, for bladder damage because he was afraid to go to the latrine at night, fearing that he would be shot. So it was harrowing duty on the ground and on the air. So Ben was flying missions, though. Initially, they flew missions on the outlying Japanese islands and then started to bomb the Japanese homeland. We go to the next slide. This was Ben with his crew and the aircraft that they named in Ben's honor. They called it the Honorable Sadsaki. They mashed up a popular cartoon strip of the time with sake, the Japanese beverage, and this was the B-29 in which Ben was flying missions. Ben flew the first firebombing raids of Tokyo. Those things started to weigh on him. Again, Ben was in the tail, and he later described flying away from Tokyo on that horrific first firebombing mission that laid waste to Tokyo. And for about 30 minutes, as they flew away from Tokyo, Ben could see this reddish orange glow that was the city of Tokyo burning, and the horrific things that were happening to men, women, and children on the ground caught in that cataclysm of flames. Those things started to weigh on Ben, and by the late spring of 1945, he had really began to struggle with combat stress and nightmares. And so the flight surgeon, the higher ups, the flight surgeon wanted to send him home, said, "You've done enough. We're going to send you home." Ben insisted on just send me to Hawaii for a few days. And so Ben and his crew were sent to Hawaii for a few days of R&R. If we get to the next slide, this was Ben being interviewed by Armed Forces Radio, Army Air Forces Radio, after flying his 28th and final mission in the Pacific. So in total, Ben flew 58 missions. If we go to the next slide, so this interview that Ben gave, it aired in the U.S. on national broadcast on the evening of August 5th, 1945. Well, with the time change, that was already Monday morning, August 6th, 1945, on Tinian and in Japan. This photograph shows the Enola Gay landing on Tinian. In the hours prior, the Enola Gay had taken off from Tinian with the first atomic bomb. It bombed Hiroshima and then landed again on Tinian. So all this was happening on the island. And in fact, the Enola Gay and other aircraft assigned to that B-29 unit, that clandestine unit that had been sent out to fly the atomic bomb missions, were parked on the Tinian North Field within sight of Ben's aircraft as well. So Ben returned to the States, having flown 58 missions. He then, before I move on to that, I want to get to an important middle piece in Ben's story, and then I'll get to the post-war period. Robert, if we could turn to the next one. So in 1944, during that time that Ben was in the States, he had come back from England. Ben had read about the incarceration, but he really couldn't wrap his head around the enormity of what was happening, this terrible tragedy of people being uprooted, sent to assembly camps, as the euphemism was, and then from assembly camps to relocation camps, another euphemism for what were essentially prisoner of war camps. The War Department sent Ben on a recruiting mission to the camps to try to recruit Nisei men to join the army. They needed Nisei recruits, Japanese American men, to serve in the army. There was an all Nisei unit that was fighting in Italy in 1944. Was first the 100th Battalion, and then that was wrapped into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And they were losing a lot of men. And so the War Department sent Ben to 3 camps, Heart Mountain, Minidoka. Heart Mountain is in Wyoming, about 10 miles from where I am right now. And then to Minidoka in Idaho, and Topaz in Utah. If we go to the next slide, this shows Ben arrived at the camp, and he later described rolling up. He was in the back seat of an army sedan, and he was shocked by what he saw. He saw the barbed wire, saw the armed guards wearing uniforms like him, facing inward toward people who looked like him. And that was the first moment that Ben really began to comprehend what had happened and what this the relocation camps really were, and the enormity of the loss. This photograph was taken of the welcoming congregation, the welcoming assembly for Ben's arrival. There was a handwritten sign on the building at the left of this photograph that said, "Welcome, Sergeant Ben Kuroki." Over the next few days, if we go to the next photo, that Ben delivered speeches. It was, it wasn't sort of a hard sell recruiting pitch, but it was a celebration of Ben's service and heroism. And Ben's message to the young men was, enlist, prove your patriotism. Now, not everyone, if you go to the next photo, Ben was welcomed as a celebrity. He signed autographs. He was something of a film star. He was the first Japanese American combat hero of World War II. And so he was seen as this wonderful role model. But there were also militants in the camp who had decided to resist the draft. They had organized, and there eventually would be 63 men from the Heart Mountain camp who would be put on trial and convicted on federal draft evasion charges and sent to federal prison. And the members of this draft resistance movement viewed Ben as a race traitor, as a tool of the government who had taken away their liberties and had inflicted on them this terrible injustice. So it was a very unpleasant experience of where Ben then was coming face to face with people who were booing him, hissing, and uh, 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 essentially debating him and Ben's argument that you need to serve and prove yourself. This incident stayed with Ben for the rest of his life. It was very painful. Uh, and the issue would be revisited for Ben late in life when the draft resistors, their stories began to be told more fully. The draft resistors were ostracized in their own communities and during the war and after the war, but eventually their stories came out, and it was a painful episode for Ben. If we can move on to the next. Now, I wanted to talk about this. This was I'll briefly work through these kind of final post-war chapters that I think were really defining moments for Ben. Ben embarked on what he called his 59th mission tour. He came back from the Pacific, an even bigger hero than when he had come back from the Europe and North Africa tour. He delivered a rousing speech at the New York Herald Tribune Forum in October of 1945. It's an annual public affairs forum at the time. And he was on the stage with General George C. Marshall, General Jonathan Wainwright, who had commanded U.S. forces in the Philippines, had been captured by the Japanese, had recently been given the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman. So Ben is on the stage with all of these dignitaries and delivers his speech, gets huge standing ovations, and that made Ben an enormous celebrity and a hot interview at the time. And so he was on radio shows, newspapers were interviewing him. Those of you who are gray like me would recognize this as Ed Sullivan. At the time, Ed Sullivan was writing a entertainment column for one of the New York papers, I believe it was the New York Post, long before he became the CBS television impresario and the famous Sunday night show. So this was Ed Sullivan interviewing Ben. Ben had all these speaking opportunities and was mustered out of the Army Air Forces in February 1946 and did a largely self-financed speaking tour over the next 15 months that took him around the country. And during that tour, he spoke about channeling the energy, the righteous energy that won World War II, that determination into what he's called winning the peace, and winning the peace by addressing issues of socioeconomic and racial injustice on the home front. Now, it was very, very bold of Ben to engage in this, and it was really this sort of brief moment of when Ben was comfortable sort of wrapping himself in the mantle of activism. And he took the stage at labor organizing rallies in New York City. And for a time, Ben became the best known Japanese American in the country. Even better known than Mike Masaoka, who was this young rising star that became the leader of the Japanese American Citizens League. And Ben began to take the stage and speak alongside Mike. But Ben was getting more microphones, more opportunities than Mike Masaoka and other prominent Japanese Americans at the time. So it was really an extraordinary time for Ben. We go to the next image. Ben spoke to, this is Ben doing a CBS radio interview. Again, he was doing these national interviews, but he was also speaking to civic groups and school groups. So we go to the next slide. Ben loved speaking to student groups, and this has been with one of the groups of students in New York State that he spoke to. And in his scrapbooks, he had wonderful correspondence late in life when Ben once again gained recognition as a national figure. He began corresponding. He heard from some of these students, and it's just some beautiful correspondence that he exchanged. He really made an impact on their lives with his humble presentation, and his again this very clarion voice for justice and for America to live up to its ideals, for America to become that more perfect union. If we could go to the next slide, please. Ben was a role model, signing autographs, getting young people tremendously loved meeting him and getting his autograph and posing for photographs. Next one. Ben finally finished his tour in the spring of 1947. He returned to Nebraska. This was Ben with the chancellor at the University of Nebraska. He earned his journalism degree and became a journalist. He owned weekly newspapers in Nebraska, Idaho, and Michigan. He wasn't a great businessman. Ben would be the first to tell you. And eventually sold his newspapers in Michigan and moved to California and worked for the better part of 20 years for the Ventura County newspaper and had a very successful career as a newspaper editor for the Ventura County paper. And Ben really didn't talk about the war a lot, but the war and the 50th anniversary commemorations in the 1990s really began to, the echoes of the war re-entered Ben's life. Ben was invited to Nebraska, and on December 6th, 1991, he delivered the keynote address at the Nebraska History Museum's commemoration, the opening of their 50th anniversary of World War II exhibition. Ben considered that the greatest honor of his life, and he thought that was the perfect ending to his public life. Little did he know that so much life and so much public recognition awaited him. In 2005, if we move on to the next slide, in 2005, Ben's comrades in the 93rd Bomb Group had started a campaign a couple of years earlier to get Ben awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by the Army. That medal was awarded in a ceremony in Lincoln, Nebraska in 2005, and that elevated Ben's profile once again. 2006, this has been at the White House, the guest of President George W. Bush at the state dinner for Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi. That's Ben's youngest daughter, Julie, at the far left. In that photograph, Ben is second from the left. Laura Bush, Prime Minister, President Bush, and then Ben's wife, Shige. Ben had three daughters. Julie played such a tremendous role in this final chapter of Ben's life. If we move on to the next slide, in 2007, this was the debut of a documentary film on Ben's life, and a wonderful story there that the filmmaker was a Japanese-American journalist and filmmaker by the name of Bill Kubota. Bill's father had been in one of the camps that Ben had visited in 1944. And after Bill Kubota became a journalist and a filmmaker, his father said, "There's a guy you ought to make a film about, Ben Kuroki." And so that started the wheels turning for Bill Kubota. He started on that film in the late 90s, and it finally was aired, and PBS picked it up. It's a wonderful 1 hour documentary on Ben's life. The Most Honorable Son was what that film was called. It was the title that I used for mine. That was Ben's nickname for his crewmates in Europe. So, in the next slide, Ben started getting more invitations. He was invited back to the White House for the annual recognition of Asia Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and Ben became something of a regular at the White House and the Smithsonian. This was a beautiful moment, and I'll close with this. At one of those ceremonies, President Bush gave a very heartfelt recognition of Ben, told the story in brief, and Ben stood up and saluted his commander-in-chief. President Bush saluted him back. And then the final slide, was after the ceremony of President Bush coming down and greeting Ben personally, and a long, warm handshake and greeting, and Ben teary-eyed. Um, Still, I think part of Ben throughout all this, he couldn't believe that this farm boy from Nebraska had achieved all the things that he had achieved, that he had overcome the things that he overcame. In closing, I just want to say that it was a great honor for me to tell Ben's story, that this is such a beautiful and extraordinary story, again, of this farm boy who grew up in poverty, dire poverty, and his perseverance, his commitment to serve, his commitment to show that he was American like anyone else was. And these are things that I think are my big takeaways, and that I cherish is what an extraordinary person he was, what an extraordinary Nebraskan, what an extraordinary Japanese American, what an extraordinary American Ben Kuroki was. Thank you. I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you very much. Anybody in the audience have any questions? Anything? Nope. You really covered a lot. There is a question. Where did he fly out of in England? My uncle Gerald Heavener, who was a right wing gunner, flew out of Rougham Field in Bury St. Edmunds on his final mission. His plane was shot down. No bodies were recovered. Thank you, Joanne, for your question.
Yes, thanks for the question. The 93rd was first assigned at Alconbury, which was about 15 miles north of Cambridge. Um, and, um, and then later, the 93rd moved further out to Hardwick, which is the area called East Anglia. It's just about 10 or 12 miles outside the old city of Norwich, which is a beautiful old city. And I've actually been to the Norwich field myself, and those were Ben's bases in England. And much of the English countryside was dotted by American bases. There had been the RAF bases, the British bases, and then the British turned a lot over for American B-17 and B-24 crews.
You have another good question. What happened to Ben's brother who enlisted? Any idea?
So Fred, served the rest of the war in the army. He returned home to the farm in Hershey. So Ben's oldest brother, George, had gone off to the University of Nebraska in the 1930s, but then their father suffered a heart attack. And so, as the oldest son, George was expected, the obligation was to come back, take over the farm. And George ran the farm for the rest of his life, never left Hershey. Fred was the only child who remained, never married, remained local, worked with George on the farm, and I interviewed George's son, and George's son said Fred was that his father George was a workaholic, and Fred was sort of a surrogate father who taught him how to hunt and fish, and told him stories and other things. So Fred was kind of the surrogate father to George's son. There sadly was something of a rift between Ben and George. I think that Ben became again this big celebrity, and I think that George had to put his dreams in abeyance. He had dreamed of becoming an engineer, and instead he grew potatoes and sugar beets, and he was really good at it. But I think it was really hard for George that he had let go of his dreams. And Ben made it clear that he did not want to have anything to do with the farm, that he wanted to get as far away from the farm. It was really hard work, and Ben wanted to do something else with his life.
Someone asked a question about Ben's family being in the camps, but they were too far away. It was I happen to know a lot about this from my own husband's family. It's the West Coast in California. Go ahead. His family wasn't in the camps.
That's correct. So the exclusion zone, what was known as the exclusion zone, was the entire state of California, parts of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. In Nebraska, they were not put in camps. They were required to register with police and to turn over all of their firearms, cameras, things of that nature that could be seen as having a military use. So yeah, and that's why Ben didn't fully fathom what was happening to the people who were in the camps. Is that his family? It was nothing compared. There was hatefulness, and some people no doubt looked at them differently, but nothing like what the families on the West Coast exclusion zone experienced.
Well, they were raising sugar beets, and sugar beets were used to help create the bombs. So I know that because my husband's oldest uncle that's how he got to leave the camps they were in at the place where you are right now, Art Mountain, because he was put on a farm to help raise sugar beets, unbeknownst, knowing that that was what they were being grown for. I don't know if you knew that, and we found that out in our research. So it's very interesting. I never knew about Ben, but thanks for sharing this story. It's quite a story. Good for you for being persistent and sticking with it. Some other comments are marvelous presentation and American hero. Fabulous. I went the summers of 73 to 75 in Hawaii with cousins who were part Hawaiian. At the time, folks, they did not care for the Japanese. Looking forward to reading your book. Bravo, superb presentation. An exposition of an important and extraordinary story of a major and extraordinary hero. Thank you. And more questions are: the FDR Museum in Hyde Park had a pretty self-critical exhibit about the internment, which was unusual in its candor given the presidential museums are fairly optimistic in their themes. Hardly makes up for the idiocy, but something at least, and perhaps better than the almost insulting cash they gave out. What structure was the 93rd? Is it a division, a unit, a brigade? How is it called? If
Yeah.
number 93, does that mean they are also 1 to 92? I'll let you answer that.
Yep, and let me just touch on, yeah, in the book, I mean, I do refer to, the FDR's executive order setting in motion the incarceration. I mean, there's no way to gloss over that. It was the most shameful episode in FDR's impactful presidency, and this hysteria, and it was political cowardice, and there was a lot of economic jealousy and a lot of those things at play in California and some of those states. And so, the hysteria about sabotage and all that was really unfounded. And tragically, FDR caved to that. And even then, when he issued the order rescinding the incarceration, that he delegated that, to subordinates rather than he be the one to have his hands, his fingerprints on that. So it was not his finest moment by a long shot. Regarding the 93rd, it was a bomb group. And so bomb group, full strength would have been about 2,000 people. Now, combat crews, again, you have this enormous ground support apparatus to make sure that the men are fed and supported, and the ordnance crews that took care of the guns and bombs and loaded the bombs into planes. So combat crews formed a portion of that. Each group was divided into 4 squadrons, so a smaller subdivision within it, and the squadron was really kind of the family within it. My uncle was in for example, the 328 squadron of the 93rd Bomb Group. Ben was in the 409th. So there wasn't sort of a logical It didn't go 329th, in this case 328th, 329th, 330th, but then the 409th was Ben's squadron. So there was a 92nd Bomb Group, but there wasn't a 1 through 93, and I don't fully know the reasons. And I think in some cases they wanted to avoid confusion, and I know that there were certain designations of how the numbers were assigned, but I'm not an expert on that, and I don't want to venture into an area that I don't feel qualified to speak to. Yeah.
Getting a lot of questions, and we've run over time. And what maybe we can do is share an email address or something. People can email you and direct their questions to you. And I'll do one more, and that'll be, let's see. So Japanese American men who were held in internment were drafted, and when they resisted the draft, they were prosecuted in prison for the refusal to serve.
Yes.
That's
Yes, and I mean, it was appalling. Eventually, there were appeals, and there was a California a federal judge who wrote a scathing opinion that overturned some of the convictions that were in his jurisdiction, and he cut right to the chase, which was it was absurd that the same government that took the constitutional rights from these individuals then said, you're required to serve in the military, and we're going to prosecute you if you don't serve in the military. So it was an absurdity, and it was eventually recognized, and President Truman eventually pardoned people convicted, but it was too little, too late, and there was this stigma that was attached to all the men who were accused of draft evasion that really, impacted their lives and their families for the rest of their lives. So,
and that's a whole other. We could get a whole other topic, and so anyway, again, if any of you have more questions, you can email.
if I could, yeah, just direct. If you go to my website, greggjonesbooks.com, there would be an email or a query option there. So look for that. I love questions, and I promise I will answer everyone. I am traveling for another 7 or 8 days. I also teach, and my school year is going to be starting in a couple of weeks. So I'm sort of doing frantic 3,000-mile plus trip with events. But I will get back to you. Just please be patient. But I'd love to hear all your questions. It's so wonderful to interact with people who love to read and love to learn about history. So thank you very much, and thanks for your patience. I know I went a bit long, but
No, thank you for. You had to go through. I want everyone to understand that you're on the road and you found a library to do this program from, and we appreciate that. Thank you, and I hope the rest of your trip goes well, and everything. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we wish you the best. And thanks to everyone that Zoomed, and thanks to my live audience. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you all very much. It was an honor.
We wish you the best.
All
Goodbye,
right.
everyone, and I hope you'll join us again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.